Most of the time, a movie is all people talking to each other, but sometimes a movie is also talking at you. So, here comes a topic near and dear to my heart. It's the top 10 narrated movies of all time, or the top 10 best uses of narration of all time. Well, this is weirdly hard to say. They say in a musical, singing occurs when the emotions of a scene can only be expressed outside the bounds of reality. The resulting song into which the characters burst becomes an illustration of that emotion, an abstraction clearly not meant as actual reality. Something similar, I think, is at play with narration. It's at once an ingrained part of our cinematic language, while also, aside from auditory hallucinations, not an expected phenomenon to encounter in our real lives. There's an artifice to voiceover narration that's undeniable, and as a tool, sloppy and flaccid as some may consider it to be.
God help you if you use voiceover in your work, my friends. God help you. It's flaccid, sloppy writing.
Filmmakers deploy voiceover in a variety of ways, and when it works, it can be the most natural thing in the world, elevating a film in the process. But how many different ways can a voice come at us out of sync and still mean something? This narrator bets there's at least 10. The most familiar place to start, one that we're all well acquainted with, is a story being told to us. This is retrospective narration. A story in its totality can't be told until it's done, looking back on the events. Film, as an art form, shares this purpose with the oldest of storytelling traditions. Tales handed down from experience, lessons imparted to one another based on hard-won wisdom. These are movies told by the characters who lived them with the benefit of hindsight. This is the wistful nostalgia of Stand By Me, The Sandlot, and A Christmas Story. The violent detachment of City of God, or A Clockwork Orange. Persepolis allows the author to tell her own unique story. Apollo 10.5: A Space-Age Childhood is an animated autobiography in its own way as well. But our favorite just might be 1999's The Virgin Suicides.
Our collection of souvenirs of the Lisbon girls, which still exists, started with Cecilia's diary. Parky'd gotten it from Skip Ortega, the plumber's assistant who had found it next to the toilet in the bathroom. Tim Weiner, the brain, decoded it.
Emotional instability.
Sofia Coppola's debut feature follows a group of 5 sisters living with an overbearing mother and largely detached father. The film itself, though, isn't narrated by any of them, save for a small bit from the mother at the end of the film. Instead, it's a single voice representing the group of boys obsessed with the Lisbon sisters. It's not one of the characters, but a representative voice, with Giovanni Ribisi simply getting a narrated by in the credits. The Lisbon sisters are unknowable to the boys, but they're obsessed nonetheless, collecting odds and ends of the girls' lives wherever they find them. Meanwhile, we don't see the girls in any great depth. We see the outlines of their characters, the way the neighborhood boys imagine a sketch of a person they're spying on through a telescope. In the end, their collection amounts to nothing. And the tragedy of the movie is that none of the participants in the story are much more than anonymous. The single-voiced group of boys, the girls whose suicides go unexplained, and the town that works hard to forget it ever happened. The Virgin Suicides is a story about the lengths to which teenage struggles can be diminished and misunderstood, and the narration, the retrospection that has no additional wisdom to offer, is a huge part of how the film works.
What lingered after them was not life, but the most trivial list of mundane facts.
Stories, however, are not always told from the safety of the end of them. Narration can take the present tense as well and happen in real time. This is a sort of guided tour through the film, as though somebody is walking you through their day-to-day. It works in movies like Mean Girls and Clueless, and the obviously related to those two Old Boy, where the protagonist also serves as a storyteller. But why stop with simple voiceover when you can go for full-on direct address? Famous fourth wall breakers, of course, include Deadpool and the movie he made fun of in his first post-credits scene, Ferris Bueller's Day Off.
You're still here?
High Fidelity and Alfie use direct address to invite you to sit in a more empathetic spot, discussing a character, flaws and all, directly with them as they live their lives. But the film that adds a twist to the real-time thing and earns our number 9 spot here is the narrator from Fight Club.
While the rest of us were sleeping, he worked. He had one part-time job as a projectionist. See, a movie doesn't come all on one big reel. It comes on a few. So someone has to be there to switch the projectors at the exact moment that one reel ends and the next one begins. If you look for it, you can see these little dots come into the upper right-hand corner of the screen.
In the industry, we call them cigarette burns.
David Fincher's deep dive into modern machismo adaptation of the Chuck Palahniuk novel flirts with some of our basest instincts. The film received its share of initially negative reviews, calling Fight Club out for glamorizing violence in a pulpy and unserious way. The other side of that coin, however, is that was kind of the point. And nothing drove that point home quite so well as the ingenious use of Edward Norton's fourth wall-breaking character.
I am Jack's smirking revenge.
After the film spends most of its runtime describing Brad Pitt's Tyler Durden lurking in the shadows on the periphery, the twist reveals the lurker to be the narrator instead. The meaning of all that flippant, toxic masculinity shifts from a thing to be paraded in the open to a thing that's always under the surface whether you realize it or not. In that sense, the narrator's function changes from a man telling his own story to a sort of warped Jiminy Cricket warning us, the viewers, of the very real vein of dangerous, boyish behavior behind these characters' motives. It was a wild twist in the novel and a near impossible one to pull off effectively on screen, but David Fincher and co. did it admirably.
Okay.
Just as Fight Club's narrator segued from a relatively straightforward narrator to a true peek behind the curtain, so too will we transition inwardly. Because getting to know someone, learning their story, is kind of the whole deal when it comes to movies. We out here in the real world all know what it's like to get to know people better, as acquaintance gives way to intimacy or vice versa. Sometimes narration is deployed on screen to accomplish just this thing. This is the inner access voiceover. This is Wings of Desire, letting us in on the thoughts and feelings of an angel in love with a trapeze artist. It's Bull Durham and Annie's innermost musings on baseball. Hedwig and the Angry Inch uses musical numbers, direct address, and flashbacks in concert, and in a way that you'd be forgiven for thinking that they're not technically narration. They are, by the way. This is also Alpha 60, gracing us with its computerized voice as insight into its own motives, in addition to communicating with the protagonist directly, which is almost a cool enough sci-fi trick to earn it this spot. Instead, though, we're going with another landmark film from the 60s, Le Noir Day.
Pourquoi ce tablier? Qu'est-ce que je suis ici? J'ai jamais été cuisinière. Pourquoi madame veut-elle manger du riz? À Dakar, jamais le cuisinier de madame n'a préparé du riz. Peut-être que le riz de Dakar n'est pas pareil que le riz d'ici. Je suis ici pour les enfants. Où sont les enfants? Pourquoi madame m'a-t-elle fait venir si les enfants ne sont pas avec elle?
A French-Senegalese co-production, Le Noir Day, titled Black Girl in its English-language release, follows Douana, a young woman from Dakar who takes a job with a French family that takes her away from everybody and everything she knows. Initially excited at the prospect of exploring a glamorous new world in the south of France, the job quickly turns into indentured servitude. The film is notable for many reasons, but where this list is concerned, the narration is incredible. Douana barely says a word aloud through the film's hour-long runtime, and instead we're granted access to her thoughts in real time. Meanwhile, her French mistress barks orders and derision at her, utterly confounded as to why she might be unhappy. The family's guests talk about her as though she's not in the room. People ask her questions, but director Ousmane Sembène cuts away before she can answer. A telling bit of filmmaking that leaves you just knowing that they're not actually interested in what Douana has to say. The narration then becomes her only outlet, but to who? The effect is listening to somebody struggle silently, which is a remarkable irony only possible in film. We've talked about the different purposes narration can serve, but there's another aspect to pulling off a good storyteller, and that's, of course, who is telling the story. And while every other narrator we talk about in this list is generally a part of the events happening on screen, sometimes they're not. These are the good old-fashioned omniscient narrators. The voice isn't coming from a character on screen, but the voice of God chiming in on the proceedings. Typically, this gives the film a more folkloric quality, a feeling that you're participating in the oral tradition, like the assassination of Jesse James by the coward Robert Ford, or the Brothers Bloom, or Amelie. Sometimes it's limited to the intro or prologue of a movie, as in Magnolia, or the Royal Tenenbaums. Sometimes, as it's brilliantly done in Y Tu Mama Tambien, the omniscient voice provides the type of inner access we've already talked about for all of the film's protagonists. But for our pick, we're going with a film that combines a little bit of everything we've included so far in this list, and The Stranger from The Big Lebowski.
How you doing there, dude?
Not too good, man.
One of those days, huh?
Yeah.
Well, A wiser fellow than myself once said, sometimes you eat the bar and much obliged. Sometimes the bar, well, he eats you.
That some kind of Eastern thing?
Far from it.
The rare occurrence of a narrator being both omniscient and on camera, the absurdity of the film sets the stage for an omniscient narrator prologuing his way through a nonsense bit of context to transition into an actual on-set human who eventually bookends the wildly silly film noir. On top of being a prime example of both omniscience and direct address, the stranger is more than just another bit in a comedy. When he shows up in the bowling alley asking for a sarsaparilla, he provides a grounding force to the proceedings, which is insane considering he's an all-knowing cowboy.
What are you talking about?
The character, on paper at least, is a cartoon. He's a broad strokes caricature of an old Hollywood cowhand, but more than perhaps anything else, he's also familiar. In the language of cinema, a narrator is something we know, a steady wall we can lean against while the rest of the movie has us drunk on bananas. So, as the impeccably cast Sam Elliott appears to the strains of the tumbling tumbleweeds, we're reminded of the bit of truth at play here. We're reminded that these bumbling bowlers are in fact human, and that we might very well know them in real life.
Oh, look at me. I'm rambling again. Well, I hope you folks enjoyed yourselves. Catch you later on down the trail.
While an omniscient perspective may have access to all the information, the other side of that coin is all the characters opening up to us individually. Of course, a film has more than one character, more than one perspective to hear from. These are the group narrators. Martin Scorsese is maybe the king of this. Goodfellas and Casino both feature ensemble casts that share their own insights through VO, largely adapted wholesale from the source material. Ditto for Sin City and the nature of directly adapting the graphic novel to the screen. There's Election and Rashomon giving us different perspectives on the same event, while in Pompoko we hear from multiple characters and an omniscient voice. But for our money, group narration has rarely been more poignant, heartbreaking, and necessary to the story than our number 6 pick, 20th Century Women.
My mom was born in 1924. When she was my age, people drove in sad cars to sad houses, with old phones, no money or food or televisions. But the people were real.
Mike Mills's fantastic sorta autobiography charts the relationships of a kid and the women who are all taking part in raising him. Where so many coming-of-age stories take the retrospective approach, the narration in 20th Century Women has a present-tense omniscience to it for the most part.
They don't know this is the end of punk.
Perhaps more than anything else, the film is about a family trying to understand each other. To that end, Mills pings back and forth between narrators, showing each character form their own thoughts about each other while not actually communicating those thoughts. Jamie shares his thoughts about his mother, while his mother, Dorothea, is able to talk about her own life in ways that don't quite match. It becomes more nostalgic as the film progresses and more of their lives pass, bringing a wisdom to the VO that comes with some additional omniscience. But the truly fascinating thing about the function of this film's narration is the bittersweetness it highlights. Here is a portrait of people who love each other deeply, but never quite have the full picture of one another. Instead, the narration is delivered with a "this is just how life is" frankness that shows us a family full of love and experience, one that doesn't necessarily need complete transparency to exist happily. And that, to me, is the beauty of 20th Century Women, and it's accomplished chiefly because of the narration. Another step farther away from an omniscient perspective that knows everything, and the other side of the coin from a group full of honest characters bearing their souls, we find the voices we can't trust. Here we find the unreliable narrators. What if we just can't believe this voice? How does that impact the story? In the case of Leonard Shelby in Memento, it questions the nature of memory and purpose. For Patrick Bateman in American Psycho, we can't be sure what is real or hallucinated, while a roguish Orson Welles very pointedly BS's his way through F for fake. But for an unreliable voice that truly makes it easy to lose your bearings, our number 5 slot goes to Last Year at Marienbad.
Qu'aucun bruit dépeint ne parvient à sa propre oreille, comme si l'oreille elle-même de celui qui s'avance, une fois de plus, le long de ce couloir, à travers ces salons, ces galeries, dans cette construction de notre siècle.
From the jump, the VO is being used for an incredibly specific effect. The narration floats from room to room, fading in and out, repeating itself in a timeless loop against some truly unnerving organ music. There's an endlessness to the old hotel. It feels impossible to know where or when we are, who's talking or to whom. And that's the entire point of the movie. In the film, a man and woman have different versions of the events that transpired, as the title indicates, last year at Marienbad. Did she agree to an affair with this man? Have they ever actually met before? It's a dark and vibey mystery from the French New Wave. The narration becomes an abstract tool to jump cut through time and space, introducing flashbacks and flash forwards, but never landing on a single version of the truth. It underlines the struggle playing out on screen between would-be lovers. Who they were a year ago or when they met is simply unknowable. Director Alan Renai, whose debut feature, Hiroshima Mon Amour, may as well be somewhere on this list, trades in obfuscating secrets and memories and the thin line between the two. The film is shot and cut with the same intention, but the effect is only truly pulled off thanks to the narration. So, at this point, we've dug into the properly highfalutin techniques that thematically align the spoken word of narration to bigger picture filmmaking goals. But before we go any further, we need to talk about some nuts and bolts. Of course, we've covered who the source of narration in a film can be, but that doesn't really include proper, on-screen, in-movie sources. Diaries are a common style of sourced VO. It might be Paul Schrader's favorite thing to do, from Taxi Driver to First Reformed and everything in between.
I've decided to keep a journal.
There's a wing of sourced narration that's actually disguised as retrospective until we catch up to it, like in Kiss Kiss Bang Bang or Easy A. Even Avatar trades in this to an extent. The Princess Bride might be the most heartwarming version of sourced narration, but for this, we have to pick our favorite count, Bram Stoker's Dracula.
25th May. Budapest. Left Budapest early this morning. The impression I had was that we were leaving the west and entering the east. The district I am to enter is in the extreme east of the country, just on the borders of 3 states, Transylvania, Moldavia, and Bukovina.
Bram Stoker's novel itself is epistolary, made up from a collection of first-hand accounts that Jonathan and Mina Harker assembled after the fact. The novel reads like evidence, like a faithful retelling of actual events, in the same way that Orson Welles' famed War of the Worlds broadcast felt urgent and possible. That was the conceit on which Stoker built the entire harrowing account of a real estate deal gone way wrong. Adapted by James V. Hart, the film is executed on screen with lavish eccentricity by Francis Ford Coppola, and in spite of rampant period inaccurate production design, the narration still nails Stoker's original intent. Coppola doesn't just use sourced VO as a way to directly adapt the novel, he built elaborate production design as a way to directly adapt the novel. Voiceover is accompanied by forced perspective model trains, dramatized voids filled with candles, and melodramatic teardrops transitioning from one letter to the next. Coppola takes the storytelling cues from Stoker's book and not only adapts them into the narration, but adapts them visually as well. The sourcing of an entire cast's worth of voiceover living on screen in gorgeous Gothic detail. If there's any sense to the organization of this list, that means it's time to talk about unsourced voiceover. This is narration that comes from seemingly no place at all. It's not from a journal or a letter, there's no direct address, omniscient narrator, or any of the other tropes we've talked about so far. The VO just kind of is. This is Nicolas Cage walking us through Raising Arizona. This is the end of Full Metal Jacket with Private Joker's thoughts accompanying the Mickey Mouse song Through Hell. But the real master of this no-strings-attached narration has to be Terrence Malick, in films like The Thin Red Line, The Tree of Life, and our number 3 pick, Days of Heaven.
We've never been this rich, all right? I mean, we were just all of a sudden living like kings. Just nothing to do all day but crack jokes, lay around. We didn't have to work.
Days of Heaven is principally known for the visuals. The film was famously shot seemingly exclusively at Magic Hour and, as a result, is objectively gorgeous. It's the story of Bill, Abby, and her little sister Linda on the run and looking for a fresh start, plotting a love triangle with a rich farmer instead. Linda, the kid being dragged in the wake of the scheming adults in her life, is not necessarily one of the main characters. She has no real agency, nor does she factor into the storytelling on screen in any sort of major way, but it's her voice narrating the film. There's a wisdom to her that almost makes the film more universal. If even a child can narrate the intricacies of the plot around her. Her voice is in past tense, so it's retrospective to a degree, but she's not telling the story to anybody, so it's hard to classify. The most fascinating thing about this narration, though, is that it was an improvised solution in post. It took Malick 2 years to edit the film. The meandering, albeit beautiful footage took a lot to come together, and the voiceover, as bucolic as the scenery, adds to the timelessness of the film and might have even rescued it.
This farmer, he didn't know when he first saw her, or what it was about her that caught his eye. Maybe it was the way the wind blew through her hair.
Sneaking up on the end of our list, we need to talk about a genre that's at least in part defined by voiceover. As inextricably linked to the tales of seedy criminal underworlds as femme fatales and high-contrast black and white photography, film noir is getting its own category here, because the best examples of narration in the genre do a little bit of everything we've talked about so far. From the opening retrospection of The Postman Always Rings Twice, to the inner longing in Brief Encounter, the hard-boiled spoof of The Naked Gun, the modern unsourced version from Joanna Newsom in Inherent Vice, to the sourced confession throughout Double Indemnity. But we're giving it to a different Billy Wilder masterpiece in Sunset Boulevard.
The poor dope. He always wanted a pool. Well, in the end, he got himself a pool. Only the price turned out to be a little high.
Legend is, Billy Wilder loved a turn of phrase, and with English being his second language, his most trusted way to indulge in clever wordplay in Hollywood is voiceover narration. To top it off, he found the perfect character through which to live vicariously in William Holden's Joe Gillis. A writer not good enough to hack it in the industry is downright poetic from beyond the grave.
Then I talked to a couple of yes-men at Metro. To me, they said no.
It's wonderfully tragic and a little funny that we see Joe's fate right off the bat. The entire film's worth of great narration is seen through the lens of a man we already know to have died trying to be a writer. In a film known, rightfully so, for the incredible Gloria Swanson and lines like,
I am big. It's the pictures that got small.
And, of course,
All right, Mr. DeMille, I'm ready for my close-up.
you'd be wrong to overlook the incredible character-building narration that fleshes out the rest of the film. The flowery narration accentuates the house, the tennis court, or rather the ghost of a tennis court, but also provides a perspective on Norma Desmond's mental state that she's not self-aware enough to offer.
She was still sleepwalking along the giddy heights of a lost career.
Joe Gillis knows the industry as a himbo who's not quite good enough to hack it, but he can still recognize what the business has done to Norma Desmond, and nowhere is it said so eloquently as the narration. We've talked this whole time about narration as a tool to accentuate the rest of a story, or to alter the experience of hearing a story from different perspectives, but sometimes narration is just the whole thing. As you might expect, these films predominantly live in the experimental realm of cinema. Think about the poetic work of Chris Marker, the science fiction still frames of La Jetée, and the sober recounting of a man's journey through time, or his pensive visual essay Sans Soleil, full of musings on memory. This is also where The Second Game belongs, a documentary about a father and son commentating on a football match the father had refereed some years prior. Jonas Mekas recreated a sense of his entire life by matching his words with home movies in As I Was Moving Ahead Occasionally, I Saw Brief Glimpses of Beauty. And while more mainstream fare like Stranger Than Fiction can make narration a central figure in a man's life,
Hello, someone there?
the final spot needs to be something more to the point, and nowhere is narration more the entire point than Derek Jarman's Blue.
In the pandemonium of image, I present you with the universal blue. Blue, an open door to soul, an infinite possibility becoming tangible.
On the surface, Blue is a dramatization of filmmaker Derek Jarman's state of mind. A gay man struggling with AIDS and the related health complications robbing him of his sight, among other faculties, Jarman chose as the narration's accompanying imagery a bold shade of blue for the film's entire runtime. His failing eyes left him with only shades of the color blue at this stage of his life, and so blue becomes a figure in the narration. It's given personality traits, it has faculty, and in between threads of voiceover chronicling Jarman's life, everything from trips to the hospital to conversations with friends, blue also becomes a dream.
To be an astronaut of the void, leave the comfortable house that imprisons you with reassurance. Remember, to be going and to have are not eternal. Fight the fear that engenders the beginning, the middle, and the end.
These wandering and frankly lovely thoughts are cut together with lengthy lists of side effects one might suffer from the drugs he receives twice a day as part of his treatment for AIDS. All the while, the audience is given only the color Jarman's eyes have left him with. Derek Jarman was a committed activist and a prominent voice for gay rights and AIDS awareness. Blue was released only a few months before his death. While the blue frame is an important part of the film, the narration is equal parts hope and anger and bitterness and wonder. The rest of the soundscape is beautiful. The performance of narrators John Quinton and Nigel Terry is rich and heartfelt, and the experience of sitting with Blue is truly remarkable, which is why I think its narration is among the best of all time. That's our list of the best narration of all time. What do you think? Did we leave out literally all of your favorites? You're welcome to tell us in the comments, but in the meantime, be sure to subscribe to CineFix for more movie lists.